And the whodunit aspects of the story, Watergate was about big themes: the constitutional separation of powers, the protection of individual rights, the function of a free press. The people of the United States were caught up in all this to a degree that might seem unlikely to anyone who didn't experience it. Day after day, week after week, we watched the drama played out in one disclosure after another. It was all on television. And through television, the people became a part of the process of judgment in the summer of 1973.
Sam Ervin was the man for the job. He was a Democrat but conservative, a former judge. His fellow senators knew him as a nonpartisan authority on the Constitution and the Bible, and as wily an old country boy as ever came out of North Carolina.
The chairman is fond of pointing out from time to time that he is just a country lawyer. He omits to say that he graduated from Harvard Law School with honors.
If the senator from Tennessee will yield, I'd like to say a word in my own defense on that point. I had a friend introduce me to North Carolina audience. He said he understood I was a graduate of the Harvard Law School, but thank God nobody would ever suspect it.
I went to Morganton, North Carolina to visit Senator Ervin, now 86 years old and retired, for some recollections of that historic summer of Watergate.
Senator Ervin, why you? How did you come to be chosen as chairman of the Watergate Committee?
Mike Mansfield, I think, is one of the finest human beings I've ever known. And he wanted the investigation to be fair, and not only wanted to be fair, but he wanted it to appear to be fair. So the first thing he did was rule out from membership among the Democrats any Democrat that was suspected of being wanting to be president or vice president. That included most of the Democrats in the Senate.
Right.
And so having done that, he told me he wanted to be chairman for 3 reasons. The first was that I had had more judicial experience than anybody in the Senate. The second was I was the most nonpartisan Democrat he had in the Senate. And the third was that nobody could justly accuse me of ever having harbored vice presidential or presidential ambitions.
What did you expect to discover at the beginning? Did you think it would reach the president?
I didn't imagine, however, the president was involved.
You did not?
I thought we would find that some of his overzealous aides had overstepped the bounds of political decency.
Did it dawn on you slowly or of a moment that the president was involved?
Well, I became suspicious that the president wasn't toting fair with, to use a North Carolina term, with the country in the matter, because as soon as the committee was set up, before it had an organizational meeting or had hired a single aide, President Nixon issued a public statement in which he said, under the doctrine of executive privilege, he would not permit any of his aides or former aides to testify before the committee. But I have noticed a long time that if a person is being investigated or tried, and they have any information, they have power that would exonerate them, they can't run fast enough to carry it to the fact finder.
The other fact finder, 1973. After the 2 frantic months of preparation, the hearings began. The 3 commercial networks and public television were there with live coverage. These would become the most extensively televised congressional hearings before or since. Scott Armstrong, a committee investigator, remembers the shock when he walked into the room.
That first day when we walked into the hearing room and suddenly saw all those cameras, it was a circus that we hadn't expected. I think all of us somewhat recoiled from the notion that the kind of public scrutiny that was going to be given us and the committee and the way in which it looked into the White House, it made us very self-conscious and wondering if we were fully prepared.
At 10:02 a.m., Senator Ervin brought his fascination with Watergate mounted by the day as the intense coverage by the news media soaked in. There were complaints from people who missed their soap operas. After the first week, the networks began taking turns covering the sessions live. The infant public television service covered live in the daytime.
From Washington,
and then rebroadcast the hearings in prime time every night into the wee hours. Aggressive investigative reporting in newspapers and magazines, particularly the work of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein for the Washington Post, had laid the basis for the Senate investigation. As for the relatively new medium of television, its importance to these hearings, to the process of public judgment, cannot be overestimated.
I wanted every American citizen to be able to hear and see the witnesses for themselves and make their own judgments, not have the judgment of somebody else. And the only way to do that, if they couldn't come to the caucus room and see and hear the witness themselves, is to watch it. And the only thing we have today, and God bless it, we have it, is through television. And it was that, and not because we wanted publicity for the committee, but in order to be able to bring all of America into a democratic process, which is the working of their Congress. And it worked, I think.
It did work. The public's curiosity and concern were reflected early every morning in the lines that formed on Constitution Avenue to get into the hearings. Watergate also was the talk of Main Street. From May to August in that summer of 1973, millions of Americans sat in their living rooms and watched this remarkable story played out in the caucus room by real people, some of whom became as familiar as the neighbors. In the course of the hearings, over 1.5 million letters poured into the committee. Most, but not all, were favorable. Terry Lenzner, one of Sam's...
About to leave, it was around 5:30, 6 o'clock in the evening. The telephone in my office rang. I had my briefcase packed. I was just at the door, and I answered it, and there's Scott Armstrong's voice. And he said, "Sam, can I come up to see you?" I said, "I got something important." Well, Scott always had something important, you know, always something important. I said, "Scott, can't it wait? I promised Sarah that I'd come home early for dinner." He says, "It's got to wait, Sam." He says, "It's very important. I've got to come up."
But we stormed upstairs and went into Sam Dash's office. And
he came up with one of our other assistants, and he was sweating. His eyes were wild.
we said, "Sam, the president recorded all of his conversations."
And when he was through, you know, I was sitting there aghast, you know, because, my God, I said, here we finally have the corroboration that we really needed for John Dean. And I called Sarah and said, "I'm going to be late." And I called Sam Ervin, I remember. And I told Ervin what we had just learned. And I remember he just felt that it was the most remarkable bit of evidence that we could have found, quoted the King James Version of the Bible, something to the effect that the truth will always come out, that you can't cover it up. And we decided then that we had to get Butterfield in as the very next public witness.
So we promptly asked for the relevant tapes, mainly conversations between Dean and Nixon. A week later, the answer came from the White House. The president would not release the tapes.
This is a rather remarkable letter about the tapes. If you notice, the president says he's heard the tapes, or some of them, and they sustain his position. But he says he's not going to let anybody else hear them for fear they might draw a different conclusion.
Laughter, then serious business. The committee announced that it was issuing a subpoena for the tapes. Not since the administration of Thomas Jefferson had Congress served a subpoena on a president.
I deeply regret that this situation has arisen, because I think that the Watergate tragedy is the greatest tragedy this country has ever suffered. I used to think that the Civil War was our country's greatest tragedy, but I do remember that there were some redeeming features in the Civil War, in that there was some spirit of sacrifice and heroism displayed on both sides. I see no redeeming features in Watergate.
President Nixon refused, so a committee of Congress decided to take a president to court for the first time in history.
The chair recognizes that there is no precedent for litigation of this nature, but originally was no precedent for any litigation. And I think this litigation is essential if we are to determine whether the president is above the law and whether the president is immune from all of the duties and responsibilities in matters of this kind which devolve upon all the other mortals who dwell in this land.
I think most of us reached the conclusion almost about the same time that these tapes were very incriminating, because if they were not, I think the president would have very happily released them.
When